blood, and ranch secrets. Rosie Sullivan had spent her whole life keeping her land safe, but when Garrett Landry rode onto her property, all quiet strength and a past he wouldn't talk about, she knew her hardest battle had just begun. He crossed his arms, watching her. "You don't trust me, do you?" he murmured. "That's all right, sweetheart. I ain't asking you to." Chapter 1. The dust settles on a solitary life. The sun beat down on the parched earth, baking the wood of the porch until it radiated a dry, almost feverish heat. Rosie Sullivan sat in her worn rocking chair, the rhythmic creak a familiar counterpoint to the relentless cicada song that filled the air. At 58, her face was a roadmap of hard-won battles and quiet resilience, etched with lines that spoke of laughter, loss, and the unwavering determination that had kept the Sullivan Ranch afloat for decades. Her hair, once the color of ripe wheat, was now streaked with silver, pulled back in a tight braid that emphasized the sharp intelligence in her faded blue eyes. She watched the dust devils dance across the vast expanse of her land, a seemingly endless stretch of rolling hills and stubborn scrub that reached towards the distant, hazy mountains. The Sullivan Ranch had been in her family for 3 generations, a legacy carved out of the unforgiving Arizona territory by her grandfather, a man as tough and unyielding as the land itself. He taught her to ride before she could properly walk, to shoot straighter than most men, and to value the land above all else. Her father, a gentler soul but no less dedicated, had instilled in her a love of books and a quiet strength that had seen her through more storms than she cared to count. But the storms had taken their toll. Her husband, Thomas, a man she'd loved with the fierce, untamed passion of youth, had been gone for 15 years, taken by a sudden fever that had swept through the valley like a brush fire, leaving her to manage the ranch alone. Her son, Caleb, restless and yearning for something more than the endless horizon, had left for the burgeoning city of Phoenix 5 years ago, his infrequent letters a bittersweet reminder of the life she'd chosen and the sacrifices she'd made. Loneliness was a familiar companion, a constant hum beneath the surface of her days. She'd learned to live with it, to find solace in the rhythm of the ranch, the changing seasons, the simple satisfaction of a hard day's work. But sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, when the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of fiery orange and bruised purple, the emptiness ached with a dull, persistent throb. She'd built walls around her heart, thick and sturdy, designed to withstand the harsh realities of frontier life. Grief, disappointment, and the constant threat of losing everything she held dear had taught her to be cautious, to trust slowly, and to rely only on herself. It was a lonely existence, but it was safe. Or so she believed. The distant rumble of hooves broke through the stillness, pulling her from her reverie. She squinted, her hand automatically going to the worn leather holster at her hip, where a Colt Peacemaker rested, a familiar weight against her thigh. It was unusual for anyone to approach the ranch from this direction, a rarely used track that wound through the treacherous canyons to the north. Most visitors, what few there were, came from the south, along the established trail that led to the small, dusty town of Redemption, a 2-hour ride away. As the rider drew closer, Rosie's grip tightened on the arm of the rocking chair. He was a silhouette against the setting sun, a dark figure on a powerful horse, his posture radiating a quiet confidence that bordered on arrogance. He rode with the ease of a man born in the saddle, his body moving in perfect harmony with the animal beneath him. He reined in his horse a few yards from the porch, the animal snorting and pawing the ground, its coat glistening with sweat. The rider dismounted in a single, fluid motion, his movements economical and purposeful. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a lean, muscular build that spoke of a life lived outdoors. His face was shadowed by the wide brim of his hat, but Rosie could sense the intensity of his gaze even from this distance. He wore the clothes of a working cowboy, worn denim jeans, a faded chambray shirt, and scuffed leather boots. A rifle was slung across his back, and a Colt revolver hung low on his hip. He took a few steps towards the porch, his spurs clicking softly on the hard-packed earth. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, his eyes, now visible beneath the brim of his hat, were a startling shade of gray, sharp and assessing, like a hawk surveying its prey. They held a hint of weariness, a shadow of something she couldn't quite decipher, but they were undeniably compelling. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, his voice a low, gravelly drawl that sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. It was a voice that had known hardship, a voice that held both strength and a hint of vulnerability. Rosie remained seated, her hand still resting near her gun, her eyes narrowed in suspicion. "This is private property," she said, her voice steady and firm, betraying none of the unease she felt. "You're trespassing." He gave a slight nod, his gaze unwavering. "I know. I'm looking for the owner of the Sullivan Ranch." "You're looking at her," Rosie replied, her chin lifting slightly in defiance. He studied her for a long moment, his eyes taking in every detail, from the weathered lines on her face to the calloused hands that gripped the armrests of her chair. "You're Rosalie Sullivan?" he asked, a hint of surprise in his voice. "I am." He removed his hat, revealing a thick mane of dark hair, streaked with silver at the temples, that framed a face that was both ruggedly handsome and undeniably haunted. There were lines around his eyes, etched by sun and wind, and a scar that ran along his jawline, a silent testament to a past he clearly wasn't eager to share. "Garrett Landry," he said, extending his hand. Rosie hesitated for a moment, her instincts warring with a strange, unfamiliar pull towards this stranger. She finally rose from her chair, her movements stiff from years of hard work, and took his hand. His grip was firm and warm, his skin rough against hers, sending another unexpected jolt through her. It was the hand of a man who knew how to work, how to fight, and perhaps how to hold a woman. "What brings you to my ranch, Mr. Landry?" she asked, her voice still guarded, but a flicker of curiosity had begun to ignite within her. The walls she'd so carefully constructed were starting to feel a little less impenetrable. He released her hand, his gaze shifting towards the vast expanse of her land. "I'm looking for work," he said, his voice losing some of its edge. "I hear you might be needing a hand." Rosie's eyebrows rose in surprise. She hadn't advertised for help, and word of mouth traveled slowly in these parts. "Who told you that?" He shrugged, his eyes returning to hers. "A fella in Redemption. Said you'd lost your husband some years back, and your son was gone. Figured you might be needing someone to help keep things running." His words, though factual, felt like a violation. A reminder of the vulnerabilities she tried so hard to conceal. She stiffened, her defenses rising again. "I managed just fine on my own, Mr. Landry." He crossed his arms, watching her. "You don't trust me, do you?" he murmured. "That's all right, sweetheart. I ain't asking you to." The way he said sweetheart was not endearing, but rather a challenge, a subtle push against the walls she presented. He was a storm gathering on her horizon, and she knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that his arrival would change everything. She just didn't know if it would be for better or for worse. The uncertainty was a knot in her stomach, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. Not since Thomas. Not since Caleb. Chapter 2. A stranger rides in. The setting sun cast long, dancing shadows across the porch as Rosie studied the man before her. Garrett Landry. The name was unfamiliar, yet there was something about him, a quiet intensity, a sense of contained power, that both intrigued and unnerved her. He stood there, patiently waiting, his gray eyes holding hers with a directness that was almost unsettling. He wasn't a young man, she estimated him to be in his late 40s, but his age only added to his rugged appeal. There was a weariness in his gaze, a hint of sadness that resonated with her own hidden sorrows. "I haven't hired help in years, Mr. Landry," Rosie said, breaking the silence. Her voice was still cautious, but the initial hostility had softened slightly. "I'm used to doing things my way." "I can respect that," he replied, his voice low and even. "But even the strongest back needs a rest sometimes. And this is a big ranch, Mrs. Sullivan. Too big for one person, no matter how capable." His words struck a chord, a truth she'd been trying to deny for years. The work was relentless, the days long and grueling. She was getting older, and the aches and pains that used to be minor annoyances were now constant reminders of her own mortality. She did need help, but the thought of entrusting her ranch, her life, to a stranger was a daunting prospect. "What kind of work are you looking for?" she asked, stalling for time, her mind racing. "Anything you need," he said simply. "I'm good with cattle, horses, fences, whatever needs doing. I'm not afraid of hard work." He looked at, she thought. His hands were calloused, his muscles honed from years of physical labor. He looked like a man who could handle himself in a fight, a man who knew how to survive in this harsh, unforgiving land. But there was also a gentleness in his eyes, a hint of vulnerability that she found strangely disarming. I need to think about it," she said finally. "It's a big decision." "I understand," he said. "I'm in no hurry. I can camp out by the creek for the night, if that's all right with you. Give you some time to consider." The creek. A sliver of unease ran through her. It was a secluded spot, hidden from the house, a place where a man could easily disappear. But it was also the only source of fresh water for miles, and she couldn't very well deny him that. "That's fine," she said, her voice betraying none of her apprehension. "But stay close to the creek. And no fires. This land is dry as tinder." "You have my word," he said, a slight smile playing at the corners of his lips. It was a smile that transformed his face, softening the hard edges, making him seem almost approachable. Rosie watched him as he turned and walked back to his horse, his movements fluid and graceful. He mounted with ease, his body a study in controlled power. He tipped his hat to her before turning his horse and heading towards the creek, disappearing into the gathering dusk. She remained on the porch long after he was gone, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Fear, suspicion, curiosity, and a strange, unfamiliar stirring of something she hadn't felt in years, a flicker of hope, perhaps, or something even more dangerous. She went inside, the familiar creak of the screen door echoing in the stillness of the house. The house felt emptier than usual, the silence more profound. She lit a kerosene lamp, the warm glow chasing away some of the shadows, but it couldn't dispel the unease that had settled over her. She walked through the familiar rooms, each one filled with memories of Thomas, of Caleb, of a life that was both simpler and more fulfilling. The worn furniture, the faded photographs on the walls, the scent of wood smoke and lavender that permeated the air, they were all reminders of what she had lost and what she was so desperately trying to hold on to. She stopped in the kitchen, her gaze drawn to the window that overlooked the creek. She could see the faint outline of his horse in the distance, a dark silhouette against the moonlit water. She wondered about him, about his past, about the secrets he carried. He was a mystery, an unknown quantity, and that made him both a threat and a temptation. She ate a simple supper of cold beans and cornbread, her appetite meager. The food tasted like dust in her mouth. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the precipice of something significant, that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. After supper, she sat in her rocking chair by the window, her gaze fixed on the darkness outside. She listened to the night sounds, the chirping of crickets, the distant howl of a coyote, the gentle murmur of the creek. She thought about Garrett Landry, about his gray eyes and his quiet strength, about the way he'd looked at her, as if he could see right through her, to the lonely, wounded heart she'd tried so hard to conceal. She knew she should send him away, tell him she didn't need his help, that she was better off alone. It was the safe choice, the sensible choice. But a part of her, a small, rebellious part that she'd thought long dead, was urging her to take a chance, to risk opening herself up to the possibility of something more. She drifted off to sleep in the chair, her dreams filled with images of dust devils and dark riders, of gray eyes and whispered promises. She woke with a start just before dawn, the sky outside beginning to lighten with the first hint of gray. She felt a sense of unease, a premonition of something about to happen. She got up, her joints stiff and aching, and went outside. The air was cool and crisp, the scent of sage and dust heavy in the air. She walked to the edge of the porch, her gaze sweeping across the vast expanse of her land. And then she saw it, a thin plume of smoke rising from the direction of the creek. He'd disobeyed her. He'd built a fire. And in that moment, Rosie knew that her life, her carefully ordered, solitary life, was about to be irrevocably altered. The smoke was a signal, a challenge, a promise of something both dangerous and alluring. And she, despite her better judgment, felt a strange, compelling urge to follow it, to see where it would lead. Chapter 3. Shadows of the Past. The smoke curled lazily into the dawn sky, a defiant wisp against the pale canvas of morning. Rosie's hand instinctively went to the peacemaker at her hip, the cold steel a familiar comfort against the sudden surge of anger and apprehension that coursed through her. He'd broken his word. He'd built a fire, despite her explicit warning. It was a small act of defiance, perhaps, but it spoke volumes about his character, or lack thereof. She walked towards the creek, her boots crunching on the dry earth, her pace deliberate and measured. The anger simmered within her, a slow burn that fueled her resolve. She'd dealt with men like him before, men who thought they could bend the rules, who believed they were above the law, men who respected nothing and no one. She wouldn't tolerate it. Not on her land. As she neared the creek, the scent of wood smoke grew stronger, mingling with the aroma of coffee, a tantalizing fragrance that, under different circumstances, would have been welcome. She rounded a bend in the creek, and there he was, squatting by a small, carefully contained fire, a tin cup in his hand. He was facing away from her, his back to the rising sun, his silhouette framed against the golden light. He didn't seem to notice her approach, his attention focused on the flames. He was humming a low, mournful tune, a melody she didn't recognize, but that somehow resonated with the quiet sadness she'd sensed in him the day before. "Mr. Landry," she said, her voice sharp and commanding, breaking the stillness. He didn't flinch, didn't even turn around. He simply took a slow sip of his coffee, his movements unhurried, almost nonchalant. "Morning, Mrs. Sullivan," he said, his voice calm and even, betraying none of the surprise or guilt she'd expected. "I told you no fires," she said, her anger rising. "This land is dry. One spark is all it takes." He finally turned to face her, his gray eyes meeting hers with a directness that was both unnerving and strangely compelling. There was no apology in his gaze, no hint of remorse. Only a quiet intensity that seemed to penetrate her defenses. "I know the risks, ma'am," he said, his voice still low and even. "I built it small, kept it contained, and I'll be sure to put it out properly before I leave." "Before you leave?" Rosie repeated, her eyebrows raising in disbelief. "You assume you're staying?" He shrugged, a slight smile playing at the corners of his lips. "A man's gotta eat, and coffee tastes better over an open fire. Besides," he added, his gaze shifting towards the rising sun, "I figured you might want to reconsider my offer. I'm a hard worker, Mrs. Sullivan, and I'm not afraid of getting my hands dirty." His arrogance was infuriating, but there was also something strangely admirable about his confidence, his refusal to be intimidated by her. She found herself wavering, her anger battling with a grudging respect for his audacity. "I haven't made any decisions," she said, her voice still firm, but the edge had softened slightly. "And breaking your word doesn't exactly inspire confidence." He set down his cup and stood up, his movements fluid and graceful. He was taller than she'd realized, his presence filling the space around them. He looked at her, his gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her heart beat a little faster. "I apologize if I caused you any concern, ma'am," he said, his voice losing some of its edge. "But I'm a man of my word, in the ways that matter. I wouldn't put your land, or you, in danger. I promise you that." There was a sincerity in his voice, a depth of feeling that she couldn't ignore. She searched his face, looking for any sign of deception, any hint of insincerity. But she saw only honesty and a weariness that mirrored her own. "What ways that matter are those?" she asked, the question escaping before she realized that by answering she let him make her a part of his game. He paused, and his eyes clouded, as if he was staring a ghost down. "Loyalty," keeping promises to those who have earned my trust, protecting the innocent, things like that. And what about the ways that don't matter? She pressed, curious despite herself. He smiled a sad, knowing smile. Rules made by people who don't understand the land, or the people who live on it. Sometimes you have to bend the rules to survive, Mrs. Sullivan. Sometimes you have to make your own law. His words sent a shiver down her spine. He was a dangerous man, she realized. A man who lived by his own code. A man who wasn't afraid to cross the line. But there was also something undeniably appealing about his rebellious spirit, his refusal to conform to the expectations of a society that had often failed him. "Tell me about yourself, Mr. Landry," she said, surprising herself with the request. "Where are you from? What brings you to this part of the country?" He hesitated, his eyes clouding over, as if he were wrestling with some inner demon. "It's a long story, ma'am," he said, his voice guarded. "And not a particularly pleasant one." "I've got time," Rosie said, her curiosity piqued. She settled down on a nearby rock, her gaze fixed on him. He sighed, running a hand through his thick, dark hair. "I'm from Texas," he said, finally. "A small town you wouldn't have heard of. I had a ranch, a family. Lost it all a few years back." His voice was filled with pain, a raw, aching grief that resonated with her own losses. She knew what it was like to lose everything, to have your world ripped apart by forces beyond your control. "How?" she asked, her voice soft, compassionate. He looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "It's a complicated story," he said, his voice tight. "Involves a land dispute, a corrupt sheriff, and a whole lot of bad blood. I made some enemies, powerful enemies. They took everything from me. My land, my wife, my child." His voice broke on the last word, and Rosie felt a pang of sympathy for him. She could see the pain etched on his face, the shadows of the past that haunted him. He was a broken man, she realized, a man who had been through hell and back. But he was also a survivor, a man who had refused to be defeated by his circumstances. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice filled with genuine compassion. "I know what it's like to lose someone you love." He looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and understanding. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It means a lot." They sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the gentle murmur of the creek and the crackling of the dying fire. The air between them was charged with a strange, unspoken connection, a shared understanding of loss and resilience. The shadows of his past had been revealed, and in that revelation, Rosie had found a flicker of something she'd thought long extinguished, a spark of hope, a glimmer of possibility, and the unsettling realization that she might not be as alone in this world as she believed. But with that realization came a new fear. Could she trust him, a man haunted by his past, a man who lived by his own code? The answer, she knew, was far from simple. Chapter 4. The Weight of Unspoken Words. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of unspoken words, of shared grief and hidden secrets. Rosie studied Garrett Landry, his face etched with the pain of his past, his gray eyes clouded with a sorrow she understood all too well. He was a man of contradictions, she realized, a man who could be both ruthless and gentle, dangerous and vulnerable. And she, despite her better judgment, was drawn to him, to the quiet strength he radiated, to the unspoken promise of something more than the solitary existence she'd grown accustomed to. "So, you're running," she said, finally breaking the silence. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. He didn't deny it. He simply nodded, his gaze fixed on the embers of the fire. "Trying to outrun my past," he admitted, his voice low and rough. "But it's always there, nipping at my heels." "You can't outrun your past, Mr. Landry," Rosie said, her voice soft but firm. "It'll always catch up to you, one way or another." He looked at her, a flicker of something akin to hope in his eyes. "Maybe," he said. "But maybe I can find a place where it doesn't hurt so much. A place where I can start over." His words resonated with her own unspoken desires, her own yearning for a second chance, for a life free from the shadows of the past. She'd been running too, in her own way, hiding from the pain, isolating herself from the world. But Garrett Landry's arrival had stirred something within her, a long-dormant longing for connection, for companionship, for something more than mere survival. "This ranch, it's been in my family for generations," she said, changing the subject, her voice filled with a mixture of pride and sadness. "My grandfather built it from nothing. My father expanded it, and I've been trying to hold on to it ever since Thomas died." "It's a beautiful place," Garrett said, his gaze sweeping across the vast expanse of her land. "A place worth fighting for." "I have fought for it," Rosie said, her voice hardening. "Against drought, against rustlers, against the bank, against everything this land could throw at me." "And you've done a damn fine job," he said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "But even the strongest fighters need help sometimes. Even the most stubborn ones need to give, sometimes." His words struck a chord, a truth she'd been trying to deny for years. She did need help. She was tired of fighting alone, tired of carrying the weight of the ranch on her shoulders. But pride and fear held her back. "I don't know if I can trust you, Mr. Landry," she said, her voice betraying her uncertainty. "You're a stranger, with a past you're not willing to fully share. And you've already broken one promise." He looked at her, his gray eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her heart beat faster. "I understand your hesitation, ma'am," he said. "But I'm a man of my word, when it counts. And I'm offering you my help, no strings attached. I'm not looking for anything in return, except a chance to prove myself." His sincerity was undeniable, and yet, a part of her remained wary. She'd been burned before, trusted the wrong people, and the scars still ran deep. But there was something about him, a quiet honesty, a vulnerability that she couldn't ignore. I need some time to think," she said, finally. "I'll give you my answer tomorrow morning." "Fair enough," he said, nodding. "I'll be here." He stood up, his movements fluid and graceful. He doused the remaining embers of the fire, making sure every spark was extinguished. He then turned to her, his gray eyes holding hers for a long moment. "Thank you for hearing me out, Mrs. Sullivan," he said, his voice soft. "And thank you for understanding." He turned and walked back to his horse, his silhouette disappearing into the shadows of the trees. Rosie watched him go, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Fear, doubt, curiosity, and a strange, unfamiliar stirring of hope. She walked back to the house, the rising sun warming her back, but the chill of uncertainty remained. She spent the rest of the day tending to her chores, her mind constantly returning to Garrett Landry. She tried to focus on the familiar tasks, the mending of fences, the tending of the garden, the checking of the livestock. But her thoughts kept drifting back to his gray eyes, his quiet strength, his haunted past. She found herself looking for him, her gaze constantly scanning the horizon, her ears straining for the sound of his horse. She told herself it was because she didn't trust him, because she needed to keep an eye on him. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. She was drawn to him, intrigued by him, and a part of her, a long-dormant part, was yearning for his presence. As the day wore on, she began to realize that she'd already made her decision. She was going to hire him, not because she needed the help, although she did, but because she needed him. She needed the challenge he presented, the spark he ignited within her, the hope he offered. She needed to feel alive again, to feel something other than the dull ache of loneliness. It was a risk, she knew, a huge risk, but it was a risk she was willing to take. She'd spent too long playing it safe, too long hiding from life. It was time to take a chance, to open herself up to the possibility of something more. Even if it meant facing the shadows of the past, both his and hers. The weight of unspoken words still hung in the air, a testament to the secrets they both carried. But for the first time in a long time, Rosie felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in carrying that weight. And that, she realized, was a start. Chapter 5. Beneath a sky full of stars. The evening air was cool and crisp, a welcome change from the scorching heat of the day. Rosie sat on the porch, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her gaze fixed on the vast, star-studded sky above. It was a sight she never tired of, a breathtaking display of celestial beauty that always filled her with a sense of awe and wonder. Millions of stars glittered like diamonds scattered across a velvet cloth, their light a silent testament to the immensity of the universe and the insignificance of her own worries. She'd spent the afternoon wrestling with her decision, weighing the risks and the potential rewards of hiring Garrett Landry. Her practical side, the side that had kept her alive and the ranch afloat for all these years, warned her against it. He was a stranger, a man with a troubled past, a man who lived by his own code. He could be dangerous, unpredictable. He could disrupt her carefully ordered life, shatter the fragile peace she'd found. But her heart, the part of her that had been yearning for something more, for connection, for companionship, urged her to take a chance. He was a man who understood loss, who had known hardship, who had faced his own demons and survived. He was a man who could be strong for her, who could share the burden of the ranch, who could fill the emptiness that had been growing within her for years. She'd seen something in his eyes, a glimmer of hope, a spark of resilience, that resonated with her own spirit. She'd felt a connection to him, a strange, unspoken understanding that transcended their differences, their pasts, their fears. And she knew, with a certainty that surprised even her, that she needed him in her life. She heard the soft thud of hooves approaching, and her heart beat a little faster. She knew it was him, even before she saw him. He rode into view, a dark silhouette against the moonlit landscape, his presence both comforting and unsettling. He dismounted and tied his horse to the hitching post, his movements fluid and graceful. He walked towards the porch, his spurs clicking softly on the hard-packed earth. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, his gray eyes meeting hers in the dim light. He didn't say anything, simply waited, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched between them, thick with anticipation, with unspoken questions, with the weight of their shared history, brief as it was. "I've made my decision, Mr. Landry," Rosie said, her voice steady and firm, betraying none of the turmoil she'd felt earlier. He nodded, his gaze unwavering.
"And? I'll hire you," she said.
"But on my terms. You'll follow my rules, you'll respect my property, and you'll keep your past to yourself, unless I ask otherwise." A slight smile played at the corners of his lips. "Fair enough, Mrs. Sullivan," he said. "I wouldn't have it any other way." "You can start tomorrow," she said. "There's a bunkhouse out back, near the stables. It's been empty for years, but it's still habitable. I'll expect you up at dawn." "I'll be there," he said. He turned to leave, but then hesitated, as if he wanted to say something more. He looked back at her, his gray eyes searching hers. "Thank you, ma'am," he said, his voice soft, "for giving me a chance. I won't disappoint you." Rosie nodded, her heart filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "See that you don't, Mr. Landry." He tipped his hat to her and walked towards the bunkhouse, his silhouette disappearing into the darkness. Rosie remained on the porch, her gaze following him until he was out of sight. She looked up at the stars again, their light seeming to shine a little brighter now. She felt a sense of peace, a sense of calm, that she hadn't felt in years. She'd made her decision, and she knew it was the right one. She'd taken a risk, a leap of faith, and she was ready to face whatever consequences came her way. She stayed for a quiet while longer, enjoying the cool night and the feeling. She found herself thinking about Garrett, the ranch, the future. Perhaps this wouldn't be such a bad thing. The silence of the night was no longer deafening, but a blanket of comfort, a quiet acceptance. She went inside, leaving the door unlocked, a gesture of trust she hadn't offered anyone in years. She climbed into bed, the familiar comfort of her old mattress and quilts enveloping her. She fell asleep quickly, her dreams surprisingly peaceful, filled with images of open skies, rolling hills, and a pair of gray eyes that held both shadows and light. She dreamt of riding alongside him, the wind in her hair, the sun on her face, a sense of freedom and exhilaration filling her soul. It was a dream she hadn't dared to dream in years, a dream of a future that might, just might, be within her reach. And beneath the vast, star-studded sky, Rosie Sullivan, the solitary rancher, finally allowed herself to hope again. The decision was made, the die was cast, and her life, she knew, would never be the same. Chapter 6. The Price of Loyalty. The rooster's crow, sharp and insistent, pierced the pre-dawn stillness. Rosie was already awake, dressed in her worn work clothes, her boots laced tight, her hair pulled back in its usual braid. She'd slept soundly, a rare occurrence these days, but the underlying current of anticipation, of a new chapter beginning, had her stirring before the sun even hinted at rising. She made coffee, the strong, dark brew filling the kitchen with its familiar aroma. She stood by the window, sipping the hot liquid, her gaze fixed on the bunkhouse. A thin stream of smoke curled from its chimney, a sign that Garrett Landry was also awake. She felt a strange mixture of nervousness and excitement, a feeling she hadn't experienced in years. She finished her coffee, rinsed the cup, and headed outside. The air was cool and crisp, the sky just beginning to lighten with the first blush of dawn. The ranch was quiet, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the distant lowing of cattle. She found Garrett in the stables, already tending to the horses. He was brushing down his own horse, a magnificent black stallion, his movements sure and practiced. He looked up as she approached, his gray eyes meeting hers with a quiet greeting. "Morning, Mrs. Sullivan," he said, his voice low and even. "Morning, Mr. Landry," she replied. "You're up early." "Old habits," he said, shrugging. "I've always been an early riser."
"Good," she said.
"We've got a lot of work to do." She showed him around the ranch, pointing out the various tasks that needed attention. The fences needed mending, the cattle needed to be checked, the irrigation ditches needed clearing. It was a daunting list, even for two people, but Garrett didn't seem fazed. He listened attentively, asking questions, his eyes taking in every detail. He was a natural, she realized, a man who understood the land, who knew how to work with animals, who respected the rhythm of the ranch. He moved with an easy confidence, his body strong and capable, his hands skilled and efficient. He was a hard worker, just as he'd promised, and he didn't shy away from the difficult tasks. They worked side by side throughout the morning, the silence between them comfortable and companionable. They didn't talk much, but there was an unspoken understanding between them, a shared respect for the work, for the land, for each other. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, the heat became more intense. Rosie paused, wiping the sweat from her brow. "Let's take a break," she said. "I'll make us some lunch." They walked back to the main house, the silence between them broken only by the crunch of their boots on the dry earth. Rosie prepared a simple meal of sandwiches and cold water, and they ate on the porch, overlooking the vast expanse of the ranch. "This is a good spread, Mrs. Sullivan," Garrett said, his voice appreciative. "You've done well here." "Thank you," she said, a flicker of pride in her voice. "It's been a lot of hard work."
"I can see that," he said.
"But it's worth it. This land, it's in your blood." "It is," she agreed. "It's all I've ever known." They finished their lunch in silence, the only sound the buzzing of flies and the distant cry of a hawk. Rosie found herself studying Garrett, his weathered face, his strong hands, his gray eyes that seemed to hold both sadness and strength. "You never told me what happened in Texas," she said, finally breaking the silence. "You said you lost everything." He looked away, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "It's a long story, ma'am," he said, his voice guarded. "And not a pretty one." "I'm not afraid of ugly stories, Mr. Landry," Rosie said. "I've lived through a few myself." He hesitated, then sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It started with a land dispute," he said, his voice low and tight. "A wealthy rancher, a man named Cyrus Thornton, wanted my land. He offered to buy it, but I refused. It wasn't for sale. It was my family's legacy. So he tried to take it," Rosie guessed, her voice filled with understanding. Garrett nodded. "He used every dirty trick in the book. He harassed my cattle, he poisoned my water, he even tried to burn me out. But I wouldn't budge." What happened? Rosie asked, her voice soft. He looked at her, his gray eyes filled with pain. He framed me, he said, his voice raw. Accused me of rustling his cattle. He had the sheriff in his pocket, a corrupt man named Brady. They arrested me, threw me in jail, and held a sham trial. Thornton's men testified against me, lying through their teeth. The jury, handpicked by Brady, found me guilty. And your family? Rosie asked, dread filling her heart. Thornton's men, they went to my ranch while I was in jail, he said, his voice breaking. They killed my wife, Sarah, and my son, little Ben. They burned the house to the ground. Rosie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She couldn't imagine the pain he must have endured, the horror of losing everything he held dear. I am so sorry, Mr. Landry, she said, her voice filled with genuine compassion. He looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and grief. Thank you, ma'am, he said. It means a lot. He paused, then continued, his voice gaining strength. I escaped from jail, he said. I had nothing left to lose. I went after Thornton, after Brady, after everyone who had wronged me. I got my revenge. And then you ran, Rosie said, finishing his story. He nodded. I had to. I was a wanted man. I've been running ever since. He fell quiet for a long moment. I owe a debt, Mrs. Sullivan. Not in money, but in loyalty. I failed to protect them, to shield them from the evils of this land. Maybe I can make up for it helping you. The price of his loyalty, Rosie realized, was his past, his pain, his very soul. And she, by accepting his help, had become a part of that story, a part of his quest for redemption. The weight of that realization settled heavily upon her, a burden she was willing to share, but a burden nonetheless. Chapter 7. Whispers in the Wind. The days settled into a rhythm, a comfortable routine of hard work and quiet companionship. Rosie and Garrett worked side by side, their efforts slowly but surely restoring the ranch to its former glory. Fences were mended, irrigation ditches cleared, cattle tended to. They spoke little, but their shared purpose, their mutual respect for the land and for each other, created a bond between them, a silent understanding that transcended words. Rosie found herself looking forward to the days, to the sight of Garrett working alongside her, his strong hands, his quiet competence, his unwavering presence. He was a steadying force, a calming influence in her life, a welcome respite from the years of solitude and struggle. She'd begun to rely on him, not just for his physical strength, but for his emotional support, for his unspoken understanding of her own losses, her own struggles. She also noticed the small things. The way he'd always make sure she had a full cup of coffee in the mornings, the way he'd anticipate her needs, the way he'd look at her, his gray eyes filled with a warmth that made her heart beat a little faster. He was a gentleman, in his own rough way, a man who respected her, who treated her as an equal, who saw her not just as a rancher, but as a woman. But the peace was fragile, a delicate balance threatened by the whispers of the past, by the secrets they both carried. Rosie knew that Garrett's past was still out there, a shadow lurking on the horizon, a threat that could shatter their newfound tranquility at any moment. And she, too, had her own secrets, her own fears, her own unresolved grief that she kept hidden beneath a facade of strength and resilience. One evening, after a long day of work, they were sitting on the porch, watching the sun set over the distant mountains. The sky was ablaze with color, a fiery display of orange, red, and purple that painted the landscape in hues of breathtaking beauty. It's beautiful, isn't it? Garrett said, his voice soft, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Yes, Rosie agreed. It always reminds me of how small we are, how insignificant our problems seem in the grand scheme of things. Maybe, he said, but our problems are still real, still important. They shape us, define us, make us who we are. And sometimes, they break us, Rosie added, her voice tinged with sadness. He looked at her, his gray eyes filled with understanding. They can, he agreed. But they don't have to. We can choose to be strong, to rise above the pain, to find a way to heal. His words resonated with her own struggles, her own determination to overcome the losses she'd endured. She'd been broken, yes, but she'd refused to stay broken. She'd pieced herself back together, slowly, painfully, but she'd survived. And now, with Garrett's help, she was beginning to thrive. "I worry about you, Mr. Landry," she said, finally, voicing the concern that had been gnawing at her for days. "Your past, it's not something you can just run away from." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know," he said, "but I'm tired of running. I want to find a place to stand my ground, a place to call home." "And you think this is it?" Rosie asked, her voice hesitant. He looked at her, his gray eyes searching hers. "Maybe," he said. "It feels right. Being here, working with you, being a part of something bigger than myself." His words sent a shiver down her spine, a mixture of hope and fear. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust him, wanted to open her heart to him completely. But the fear still lingered, the fear of being hurt again, of losing everything she held dear. "I won't lie, Mrs. Sullivan," he continued. "There's a chance my past could catch up to me. There's a chance it could bring trouble to this ranch, to you. I know the risks," Rosie said, her voice firm, "but I'm not afraid."
Eva faced vers.
"You're a brave woman, Rosalie," he said, his voice filled with admiration. He used her first name, a subtle shift in their relationship, a sign of growing intimacy. She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "And you're a good man, Garrett," she said. "Despite everything." They sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the gentle breeze whispering through the trees. The air between them was charged with unspoken emotions, with a growing attraction that neither of them could deny. He reached out, his hand hesitantly hovering over hers. She didn't pull away. He gently took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers, sending a jolt of warmth through her. It was a simple gesture, a touch of comfort, of connection, but it spoke volumes. "I won't let anything happen to you, Rosalie," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I promise you that." His words were a vow, a pledge of protection, a promise of loyalty. And Rosie, despite her fears, despite her doubts, believed him. She squeezed his hand, her heart filled with a hope she hadn't felt in years, a hope that maybe, just maybe, they could build a future together, a future free from the shadows of the past. But the whispers in the wind, the subtle reminders of the dangers that lurked, served as a constant reminder that their peace was fragile, their future uncertain. The price of loyalty, she knew, could be steep. And she was ready to pay it, whatever it may be. Chapter 8. A Storm Brews. The tranquility of the ranch was shattered by the arrival of 3 riders, their horses kicking up dust as they approached the main house at a fast gallop. Rosie, who had been tending to the garden, straightened up, her hand instinctively going to the rifle she always kept nearby. Garrett, who had been mending a fence in a nearby field, also noticed the approaching riders, his body tensing, his gray eyes narrowing in suspicion. The riders reined in their horses a few yards from the porch, their faces grim, their postures radiating hostility. They were strangers to Rosie, rough-looking men with weathered faces and hard eyes. They wore the clothes of working cowboys, but there was something about them, an air of menace, that suggested they were more than just ranch hands. The lead rider, a burly man with a scar across his cheek, dismounted and approached the porch, his spurs clicking on the hard-packed earth. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, his eyes scanning Rosie and then settling on Garrett, who had walked up beside her, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver. "You Landry?" the scarred man asked, his voice gruff and demanding. Garrett didn't answer, his gaze unwavering, his body poised for action. The silence stretched, thick with tension, the air heavy with unspoken threats. "We're looking for a man named Garrett Landry," the scarred man continued. "He's wanted for murder and jailbreak in Texas. We're here to take him back." Rosie felt a chill run down her spine. She'd known this day might come, but she'd hoped, foolishly perhaps, that it wouldn't. She looked at Garrett, her heart pounding in her chest. He met her gaze, his expression grim but resolute. "I'm Landry," he said, his voice calm and steady. But I'm not going anywhere with you. The scarred man smirked. You don't have a choice, Landry. We're bounty hunters. We've got a warrant for your arrest. That warrant's no good here, Garrett said. This is Arizona, not Texas. And I haven't broken any laws here. We'll see about that, the scarred man said. He turned to his companions, who had remained mounted, their hands hovering near their weapons.
Take him.
The two riders dismounted, drawing their revolvers. Rosie stepped forward, her rifle raised, her voice sharp and commanding. Hold it right there, she said. This is my property. You're not taking anyone anywhere without my permission. The scarred man turned to her, his eyes filled with contempt. Stay out of this, old woman, he said. This ain't your fight. This is my ranch, Rosie retorted. And this man is working for me. He's under my protection. Protection? The scarred man scoffed. You think you can protect him from us? I can try, Rosie said, her finger tightening on the trigger. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the threat of violence. Garrett stepped in front of Rosie, shielding her with his body. Leave her out of this, he said to the scarred man. This is between you and me. It don't have to be, the scarred man said. Just come quietly, and no one gets hurt. I'm not going back, Garrett said, his voice unwavering. I'm innocent of those charges. I was framed. Tell it to the judge, the scarred man said. He nodded to his companions, and they moved towards Garrett, their revolvers raised. Rosie raised her rifle, aiming at the scarred man. Don't make me shoot, she said, her voice steady but firm. The scarred man hesitated, his eyes flickering between Rosie and Garrett. He knew they were both prepared to fight, and he knew he was outnumbered. He also knew that killing a woman, even an old woman who was defending her property, would bring the wrath of the local law down on him. We'll be back, he said, finally, his voice filled with menace. With more men. And we'll take you, Landry, one way or another. He turned and mounted his horse, his companions following suit. They galloped away, leaving a cloud of dust in their wake. Rosie lowered her rifle, her hands trembling. She looked at Garrett, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and fear. They'll be back, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I know, Garrett said, but we'll be ready for them. He turned to her, his gray eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, Rosalie, he said, for standing up for me. You didn't have to do that. You're working for me, Garrett, she said. I protect my own. Her words were simple, but they spoke volumes. She'd chosen her side, cast her lot with him, and she was prepared to face the consequences, whatever they may be. The storm had broken, and they were in the thick of it, together. The fragile peace they'd found was shattered, replaced by the harsh reality of Garrett's past, a past that had caught up to them with a vengeance. And Rosie, the solitary rancher, found herself once again fighting for her land, for her life, and for the man who had become more than just an employee, more than just a friend. He had become a part of her, a part of her heart, a part of her destiny. Chapter 9. Lines drawn in the sand. The threat hung heavy in the air, a palpable tension that permeated the ranch. Rosie and Garrett knew the bounty hunters would return, and they prepared for the inevitable confrontation. They fortified the ranch, strengthening the defenses, gathering supplies, and making plans. Rosie, despite her age, was a formidable opponent. She was a crack shot, a skilled horsewoman, and she knew the land like the back of her hand. She'd faced down rustlers, outlaws, and natural disasters in her time, and she wasn't about to back down from a few bounty hunters, no matter how dangerous they might be. Garrett, too, was prepared. He was a skilled fighter, a man who had lived by his wits and his gun for years. He was calm and collected, his movements precise and efficient, his gray eyes constantly scanning the horizon, assessing the threats, planning his strategy. They worked together seamlessly, their skills complementing each other, their shared purpose uniting them. They spoke little, but their unspoken communication was clear and effective. They knew what needed to be done, and they did it, without hesitation, without complaint. But beneath the surface of their preparations, there was an undercurrent of fear, of uncertainty. They knew this was a fight they might not win. The bounty hunters were likely to return with reinforcements, and they were unlikely to show any mercy. Rosie found herself thinking about Thomas, about Caleb, about the life she'd built on this ranch, the life she was so desperately trying to protect. She'd lost so much already, and the thought of losing it all again, of losing Garrett, filled her with a dread she hadn't felt in years. She also thought about Garrett's past, about the injustice he'd suffered, about the pain he carried. She understood his desire for revenge, his need for redemption. And she was determined to help him, to stand by him, to fight alongside him, whatever the cost. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, watching the sun set, Rosie spoke her mind. "You could leave, Garrett," she said, her voice soft. "You could ride out, disappear, start over somewhere else. You don't have to stay and fight." He looked at her, his gray eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and gratitude. "And leave you to face them alone?" he asked. "I wouldn't do that, Rosalie. I gave you my word. I'll stand by you no matter what."
"But it's not your fight," she said.
"It's my ranch, my problem." "It's our problem now," he said, his voice firm. "I'm not running anymore. I'm tired of running. I'm going to stand my ground, here, with you." His words sent a warmth through her, a feeling of gratitude and affection that she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "Thank you, Garrett," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It means more than you know." They sat in silence for a long moment, their hands clasped together, their gazes fixed on the fading light. The air between them was charged with unspoken emotions, with a growing intimacy that transcended their circumstances, their fears, their pasts. "I care about you, Rosalie," Garrett said, finally, his voice hesitant, as if he were afraid of revealing too much. Rosie's heart skipped a beat. She looked at him, her eyes searching his. "I care about you too, Garrett," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He leaned closer, his gray eyes holding hers, his breath warm on her face. He hesitated for a moment, then gently cupped her cheek with his hand, his thumb tracing the lines etched by time and hardship. He leaned in and kissed her, a soft, tender kiss that spoke of longing, of gratitude, of a shared hope for a future they might not have. Rosie closed her eyes, her heart overflowing with a mixture of joy and sorrow, of fear and anticipation. It was a kiss that had been a long time coming, a kiss that sealed their bond, a kiss that acknowledged the unspoken love that had blossomed between them. But the moment was fleeting, shattered by the distant sound of approaching horses. They broke apart, their eyes meeting, their hearts pounding. The bounty hunters were back. Garrett stood up, his hand going to his revolver. "It's time," he said, his voice grim. Rosie nodded, her own hand reaching for her rifle. "Let's do this," she said, her voice firm, her eyes filled with a steely determination. They walked to the edge of the porch, their bodies tense, their weapons ready. The riders approached, their numbers greater than before, their faces hidden in the shadows of the dusk. The lines had been drawn in the sand. The battle was about to begin, and Rosie and Garrett stood together, ready to face whatever came their way, their love a shield against the storm, their loyalty a weapon against the darkness. They were ready to fight for their lives, for their land, and for the fragile hope of a future together, a future that hung precariously in the balance. Chapter 10. Scars of the Heart. The night erupted in a cacophony of gunfire and shouts. Rosie and Garrett, positioned on the porch, had the advantage of height and cover, but the bounty hunters were numerous and relentless. They poured a hail of bullets towards the house, splintering wood, shattering windows, and forcing Rosie and Garrett to take cover behind the thick wooden pillars of the porch. Rosie, despite her age, was a formidable opponent. She fired her rifle with deadly accuracy, her shots finding their mark, forcing the bounty hunters to scatter and seek cover. Garrett, too, was a skilled marksman, his revolver spitting lead with deadly precision. They fought side by side, their movements coordinated, their communication minimal but effective. They covered each other, reloaded each other's weapons, and anticipated each other's needs. They were a team, bound together by their shared purpose, their mutual respect, and their growing love. But the bounty hunters were persistent, their numbers overwhelming. They slowly but surely began to gain ground, flanking the house, trying to get behind Rosie and Garrett. One of the bounty hunters, a young, reckless man, managed to sneak around to the back of the house. He burst through the kitchen door, his revolver raised, his eyes searching for Rosie and Garrett. Rosie, who had been reloading her rifle, saw him just in time. She dropped her rifle and lunged for him, tackling him to the ground. They struggled, the young man trying to bring his revolver to bear, Rosie fighting with the strength of desperation. Garrett, hearing the commotion, rushed inside the house. He saw Rosie struggling with the bounty hunter, her face contorted in effort, her body strained. He raised his revolver, but hesitated, afraid of hitting Rosie. The bounty hunter, seeing his chance, managed to break free from Rosie's grasp. He raised his revolver, aiming at her. Garrett fired, his shot hitting the bounty hunter in the shoulder. The man screamed in pain, dropping his revolver. Rosie quickly grabbed it, pointing it at the wounded man. "Don't move," she said, her voice trembling but firm. Garrett rushed to her side, his eyes filled with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Just a bit shaken." They tied up the wounded bounty hunter, leaving him in the kitchen under Rosie's watchful eye. Garrett returned to the porch, resuming the fight against the remaining bounty hunters. The battle raged on, the night filled with the sounds of gunfire, shouts, and the screams of wounded men. Rosie, despite her initial fear, found a strange sense of calm, a focus that sharpened her senses and steeled her nerves. She was fighting for her life, for her home, for the man she loved. And she wouldn't give up, not without a fight. As the night wore on, the tide of the battle began to turn. Rosie and Garrett, with their superior marksmanship and their knowledge of the terrain, managed to pick off several of the bounty hunters. The remaining men, demoralized and wounded, began to retreat, disappearing into the darkness. Silence descended upon the ranch, broken only by the moans of the wounded bounty hunter in the kitchen and the ragged breathing of Rosie and Garrett. They stood together on the porch, but the threat of further violence still hung over them. They knew that Cyrus Thornton, the man who had wronged Garrett, was unlikely to give up so easily. He was a powerful and ruthless man, with a long reach and a thirst for revenge. He would likely send more bounty hunters, or worse, after Garrett. Rosie and Garrett found themselves caught between a rock and a hard place. They could stay and fight, risking their lives and the future they were trying to build. Or they could run, abandoning the ranch, the only home Rosie had ever known, and starting over somewhere else. They debated their options, their discussions often heated, their fears and anxieties clashing. Rosie was fiercely attached to the ranch, to the land that had been in her family for generations. She couldn't imagine leaving it, abandoning her heritage, her memories, her life's work. Garrett, on the other hand, was more pragmatic. He'd lost everything once before, and he was determined not to let that happen again. He was willing to sacrifice the ranch if it meant protecting Rosie, keeping her safe from harm. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch, exhausted from another day of hard work, the tension between them reached a boiling point. "We can't stay here, Rosalie," Garrett said, his voice firm. "It's too dangerous. Thornton will never give up. He'll keep coming after us until one of us is dead." "And where would we go?" Rosie asked, her voice laced with frustration. "We'd be running forever, always looking over our shoulders, never knowing when the next threat will appear." "We could go to California," Garrett suggested. "Start over, build a new life. No one would know us there." "And what about the ranch?" Rosie asked, her voice rising. "What about my family's legacy? What about everything we've worked for?" "It's just land, Rosalie," Garrett said, his voice softening. "It's not worth your life." "It's more than just land, Garrett," Rosie exclaimed, her eyes flashing with anger. "It's my home. It's my history. It's everything I have. And I'm supposed to be everything to you," Garrett said, standing. The volume and anger in his voice were new, shocking Rosie. You think those memories will keep you warm at night? Will memories reload your rifle when those bounty hunters come back?
Don't you dare talk to me like that.
Rosie stood to match his posture, if not his height. I have to, Rosalie, Garrett said. You are being rash, only thinking of the past. I have seen the future, and I won't let my past dictate yours. They stood there, glaring at each other, the air thick with anger and resentment. The love that had blossomed between them seemed to wither, replaced by the harsh reality of their situation, by the impossible choices they faced. Finally, Rosie turned away, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I don't know what to do, Garrett, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I'm so tired of fighting. I'm so tired of being afraid. Garrett's anger subsided, replaced by a wave of guilt and remorse. He walked over to her, gently placing his hands on her shoulders.
I know, he said, his voice soft. I'm sorry, Rosalie.
I didn't mean to yell. I'm just scared. I don't want to lose you. She turned to him, her eyes filled with tears. I don't want to lose you either, Garrett, she said. But I don't want to lose my home. He pulled her close, embracing her tightly. She rested her head on his chest, her body trembling. They stood there for a long moment, holding each other, their love a fragile flame flickering in the darkness of their uncertainty. They were trapped, caught between their love for each other and the impossible choices they faced, their future hanging precariously in the balance, their hearts torn between their desires and their fears. The weight of their predicament, the scars of their pasts, and the looming threat of the future pressed down on them, a heavy burden that threatened to crush their spirits and extinguish the fragile flame of their love. Chapter 12. Echoes of Betrayal. The uneasy truce between Rosie and Garrett held, but the underlying tension remained. They continued to work on the ranch, preparing for the inevitable return of Thornton's men, but their conversations were strained, their laughter infrequent, their nights filled with a restless unease. One morning, a rider approached the ranch, a lone figure on a weary horse. Rosie and Garrett, alerted by the sound of hooves, grabbed their rifles and took up positions on the porch, their bodies tense, their eyes narrowed in suspicion. As the rider drew closer, they recognized him. It was Jed, an old friend of Rosie's, a neighboring rancher who lived a few miles to the south. He was a grizzled old man, with a weathered face and kind eyes, a man Rosie had known and trusted for years. Jed reined in his horse, his face grim, his posture radiating concern. He dismounted slowly, his movements stiff and pained. Rosie, Garrett, he said, his voice hoarse. I've got bad news. Rosie felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. What is it, Jed? She asked. It's Thornton, Jed said. He's hired a new bunch of men. Hardened criminals, killers. He's offering a big reward for Landry's capture, dead or alive. Garrett's jaw tightened, his gray eyes hardening. How many? He asked. At least a dozen, Jed said. Maybe more. They're heavily armed, and they're not afraid to use violence. Rosie's heart sank. This was worse than she'd feared. A dozen men, hardened criminals, was a force they couldn't possibly hope to defeat. He's also spreading rumors, Jed continued, saying that Landry is a dangerous outlaw, a murderer, a threat to the whole territory. He's turning the local ranchers against you, Rosie, offering them rewards for information, for assistance in capturing Landry. Rosie felt a wave of despair wash over her. Thornton was not only attacking them directly, he was also undermining their support system, turning their neighbors against them, isolating them, making them even more vulnerable. We have to leave, Rosalie, Garrett said, his voice firm. There's no other choice. We can't fight them all. Rosie hesitated. She knew he was right, but the thought of abandoning her ranch, of leaving everything she'd ever known, was almost unbearable. Jed, can you help us? She asked, her voice pleading. Can you give us some time, some supplies, a head start? Jed looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pity and regret. I'm sorry, Rosie, he said. I can't. Thornton's got spies everywhere. If I help you, he'll come after me, after my family. I can't risk that. Rosie's heart sank. She understood Jed's fear, his need to protect his own. But his refusal was a devastating blow, a betrayal that cut her to the core. I understand, she said, her voice trembling.
I'm sorry. Je repeated.
He looked at Garrett, his expression grim. You're a good man, Landry. But you're in a bad situation. My advice is to get out while you still can. He turned and mounted his horse, his movements slow and deliberate. He rode away, disappearing into the distance, leaving Rosie and Garrett alone, facing an impossible situation. Rosie felt a surge of anger, of betrayal, of despair. She'd trusted Jed, relied on him, considered him a friend. And he turned his back on her, abandoned her in her time of need. He's a coward, she said, her voice filled with bitterness. He's just scared, Rosalie, Garrett said, his voice calm. He's protecting his own. I can't blame him for that. But he's our friend, Rosie protested. Or he was. Friendship only goes so far, Rosalie, Garrett said. When it comes down to it, people will always choose their own survival. His words were harsh, but Rosie knew they were true. She'd learned that lesson the hard way over the years. People were unreliable, fickle, prone to betrayal. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. She looked at Garrett, her eyes searching his. What do we do now? She asked, her voice filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. We leave, he said, his voice firm. Tonight. We'll pack what we can, take the best horses, and head north. We'll try to lose them in the mountains. It was a desperate plan, a long shot, but it was their only option. They had no allies, no support, no one to turn to. They were alone, facing an overwhelming force, their only hope to outrun their pursuers, to disappear into the vast, unforgiving wilderness. They spent the rest of the day preparing for their departure, their movements hurried, their hearts heavy with a mixture of fear and sorrow. They packed their belongings, their supplies, their memories. They said goodbye to the ranch, to the home they'd built, to the life they'd known. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the land, they mounted their horses, ready to leave. Rosie took one last look at the ranch, her eyes filling with tears. It was more than just a piece of land, more than just a house. It was her heritage, her history, her heart. And she was leaving it all behind, abandoning it to the wolves, to the vultures, to the man who had destroyed Garrett's life and was now threatening to destroy hers. She turned to Garrett, her face etched with a mixture of grief and determination. Let's go, she said, her voice choked with emotion. They rode out, disappearing into the darkness, their silhouettes fading against the twilight sky. The echoes of betrayal lingered, a bitter reminder of the friends they'd lost, of the trust that had been broken. They were alone on the run, their future uncertain, their only companion the fear that gnawed at their hearts and the faint, flickering hope that they might somehow, against all odds, survive. Chapter 13. The Unforgiving Land. The flight was arduous, a desperate race against time and the elements. Rosie and Garrett rode through the night, pushing their horses to their limits, the vast, unforgiving landscape stretching out before them, a seemingly endless expanse of rock, sand, and scrub. They followed the winding trails, the hidden canyons, the dry riverbeds, trying to lose their pursuers in the labyrinthine wilderness. The land was harsh, unforgiving, a test of their endurance, their resilience, their will to survive. The sun beat down on them mercilessly during the day, the heat radiating from the rocks, the air shimmering with mirages. The nights were cold, the wind whipping through the canyons, chilling them to the bone. They rationed their food and water, their supplies dwindling rapidly. They slept in snatches, taking turns keeping watch, their ears constantly straining for the sound of approaching horses, their eyes scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. Their bodies ached, their muscles screamed in protest, their minds were numb with exhaustion. But they pressed on, driven by their determination to escape, to survive, to find a safe haven, a place where they could finally rest, rebuild, and start over. Rosie, despite her age, proved to be remarkably resilient. She rode with the skill and determination of a woman half her age, her body adapting to the harsh conditions, her spirit refusing to be broken. She drew strength from Garrett, from his quiet confidence, his unwavering support, his unspoken love. Garrett, too, was pushed to his limits. He was haunted by the fear of failure, by the knowledge that Rosie's life depended on him, by the constant threat of Thornton's men catching up to them. He relied on his instincts, his experience, his knowledge of the land to guide them, to keep them safe. They spoke little, their communication reduced to essential words, to shared glances, to the unspoken understanding that had grown between them. They were two souls bound together by their shared ordeal, their mutual dependence, their growing love. One evening, as they were making camp in a secluded canyon, their horses exhausted, their supplies almost gone, they saw a sight that filled them with both hope and dread. Smoke. A thin plume of smoke rising from a nearby ridge, a sign of human presence. They debated their options. It could be Thornton's men, lying in wait for them. Or it could be someone else, someone who might offer them help, shelter, a chance to survive. "We have to risk it," Garrett said, his voice low. "We're running out of food, out of water. We can't go on much longer." Rosie nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. "I agree," she said. "Let's go." They approached the source of the smoke cautiously, their rifles ready, their senses alert. As they rounded a bend in the canyon, they saw a small cabin nestled among the rocks, a wisp of smoke curling from its chimney. A woman stood outside the cabin, her back to them, her attention focused on a small fire she was tending. She was old, her hair white, her body frail, but there was a strength in her posture, a resilience in her stance. "Hello," Garrett called out, his voice echoing in the stillness of the canyon. The woman turned, her eyes, a startling shade of blue, widening in surprise. She studied them for a moment, her gaze sharp and assessing.
"Who are you?"
she asked, her voice surprisingly strong. "What do you want?" "We're travelers," Garrett said. "We're lost, and we're running out of supplies. We saw your smoke, and we hoped you might be able to help us." The woman looked at them, her eyes filled with suspicion. "I don't get many visitors out here," she said. "Especially not ones who are armed." "We mean you no harm," Rosie said, stepping forward. "We're just looking for a place to rest, to get some food and water." The woman studied them for a long moment, her gaze lingering on Rosie, then shifting to Garrett. She seemed to be weighing their words, assessing their intentions, searching for any sign of deception. "My name is Martha," she said, finally, "and you're welcome to stay the night. But I don't have much to offer. Just a roof over your head and some simple food." "That's more than enough," Garrett said, relief flooding through him.
"Thank you, ma'am."
Martha led them into the cabin, a small, rustic structure, but clean and surprisingly comfortable. She offered them food, a simple stew of dried meat and vegetables, and water from a nearby spring. They ate in silence, their hunger ravenous, their gratitude overwhelming. Martha watched them, her blue eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and compassion. "You're running from something," she said, finally breaking the silence. "Or someone." Garrett hesitated, then nodded. "We are," he admitted. "We're being pursued." Martha didn't ask for details, didn't pry into their past. She simply nodded, her expression understanding. "This land is full of people running," she said. "Running from their pasts, running from the law, running from themselves. It's a hard land, an unforgiving land. But it can also be a refuge, a place to hide, a place to start over." Her words offered a glimmer of hope, a sense that they might have found a temporary sanctuary, a place where they could rest, recover, and plan their next move. The unforgiving land, which had tested them to their limits, had also led them to this unexpected haven, to this old woman who offered them kindness, shelter, and a glimmer of hope in the midst of their desperate flight. But even in this sanctuary, the shadow of their pursuers loomed, a constant reminder that their respite was temporary, their future uncertain. Chapter 14. A Glimmer of Hope. Martha's cabin became a temporary sanctuary, a place where Rosie and Garrett could rest, recover, and regain their strength. Martha, despite her initial reserve, proved to be a kind and generous host. She shared her meager supplies, her knowledge of the land, and her wisdom gleaned from years of living in solitude. She was a woman of few words, but her actions spoke volumes. She tended to their horses, she helped them repair their gear, and she shared stories of the land, of the people who had come before them, of the struggles and triumphs of life in the wilderness. Rosie and Garrett, in turn, helped Martha with her chores, chopping wood, tending her small garden, and repairing the roof of her cabin. They found a sense of purpose in the work, a distraction from their fears, a way to repay Martha's kindness. They learned that Martha had lived in the cabin for over 20 years, ever since her husband, a prospector, had died in a mining accident. She'd chosen to stay, to live a solitary life, to find solace in the beauty and the harshness of the land. She was a self-sufficient woman, a survivor, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. She knew how to hunt, how to trap, how to grow her own food, how to survive in the wilderness. She was a font of knowledge, a source of inspiration for Rosie and Garrett. As the days passed, a sense of peace settled over them, a temporary reprieve from the constant fear and tension of their flight. They began to heal, both physically and emotionally. The wounds of the past, both theirs and Martha's, began to close, replaced by a growing sense of hope, of possibility. One evening, as they were sitting around the fire, sharing stories and laughter, Martha spoke about the legend of a hidden valley, a place of peace and abundance, a sanctuary where people could escape the troubles of the outside world. "They say it's somewhere in these mountains," she said, her voice low and mystical. "A place where the water runs clear, the grass grows green, and the wildlife is plentiful. A place where people can live in harmony with nature, free from violence, free from greed, free from fear." Rosie and Garrett listened intently, their hearts filled with a mixture of skepticism and longing. It sounded like a fairy tale, a myth, a dream. But in their desperate situation, even a faint glimmer of hope was enough to ignite their imaginations, to fuel their desire to find a better future. "Do you believe it's real, Martha?" Rosie asked. Martha shrugged, her blue eyes twinkling. "I don't know," she said. "But I like to think it is. It gives me hope. And hope is a powerful thing, especially in times like these." Garrett, who had been silent, spoke up. "If it's real, we should try to find it," he said, his voice filled with a newfound determination. "It's a chance for a new life, a chance to escape Thornton, a chance to build something better." Rosie looked at him, her heart swelling with love and admiration. He was a man of action, a man of courage, a man who refused to give up hope, even in the face of overwhelming odds. "We'll do it together," she said, her voice firm. "We'll search for this hidden valley, and we'll build a new home, a new life, together." Martha smiled, her eyes filled with warmth and approval. "I'll help you," she said. "I know these mountains like the back of my hand. I'll guide you, show you the way." And so, a new quest began. A search for a mythical paradise, a hidden valley that might or might not exist. But the search itself, the shared purpose, the renewed hope, was enough to lift their spirits, to strengthen their bond, to give them a reason to keep going, to keep fighting, to keep believing in a better future. The glimmer of hope, sparked by an old woman's tale, had ignited a fire within them, a fire that would guide them through the darkness, through the challenges, through the uncertainties that lay ahead. They were no longer just running from something, they were running towards something that might be just a dream, but a dream worth pursuing, a dream worth fighting for. Chapter 15. The Heart's Reckoning. The search for the hidden valley consumed them, a quest that led them through treacherous mountains, across arid plains, and into the heart of the unforgiving wilderness. Martha, despite her age, proved to be an invaluable guide, her knowledge of the land, her instincts honed by years of living in solitude, guiding them through the labyrinthine landscape. They faced numerous challenges, navigating treacherous trails, enduring harsh weather, and rationing their dwindling supplies. They encountered wildlife, both beautiful and dangerous, from majestic eagles soaring overhead to stealthy mountain lions stalking their prey. But through it all, their determination never wavered. They were driven by their shared dream, by their hope for a better future, by their love for each other. The quest had become more than just a search for a place. It had become a journey of self-discovery, a test of their resilience, a crucible that forged their bond even stronger. Rosie found herself changing, evolving. The hard edges that had defined her for so long, the walls she built around her heart, began to crumble. She was learning to trust again, to open herself up to the possibility of love, of happiness, of a future free from the shadows of the past. Garrett, too, was undergoing a transformation. The guilt and the anger that had consumed him for so long began to dissipate, replaced by a growing sense of peace, of purpose, of belonging. He was finding redemption in his love for Rosie, in his commitment to building a new life with her. One evening, as they were camped by a small stream, the stars glittering above them like diamonds scattered across a velvet cloth, Garrett turned to Rosie, his gray eyes filled with a depth of emotion that took her breath away. "Rosie," he said, his voice low and earnest. "I know we've been through a lot, and I know the future is uncertain, but I want you to know that I love you, more than anything in this world." Rosie's heart overflowed with emotion. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his. "I love you too, Garrett," she said, her voice choked with tears. "More than I ever thought possible." He pulled her close, embracing her tightly. They kissed, a long, passionate kiss that sealed their love, their commitment, their shared hope for the future. "I want to marry you, Rosalie," Garrett said, his voice husky with emotion. "I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Wherever we end up, whatever happens, I want to be your husband." Rosie's eyes filled with tears of joy. "Yes, Garrett," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." They held each other, their hearts overflowing with love, their bodies trembling with anticipation. They had found each other in the midst of chaos, in the face of adversity, and their love had blossomed, strong and resilient, a beacon of hope in the darkness. But even in this moment of joy, a shadow of doubt lingered. They still hadn't found the hidden valley, and the threat of Thornton's pursuit remained. Their future was still uncertain, their happiness fragile. The next morning, as they were preparing to continue their search, Martha suddenly stopped, her eyes fixed on a distant peak. "I see it," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "I see the entrance to the valley. It's there, just beyond that ridge." Rosie and Garrett followed her gaze, their hearts pounding with anticipation. They saw a narrow opening in the rock face, a passage that seemed to lead into the heart of the mountain. It was a moment of truth, a reckoning of their hearts. They had come so far, endured so much, and now, they were on the verge of finding their dream, of reaching their sanctuary, of fulfilling their hope for a better future. They looked at each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of excitement, fear, and unwavering determination. They had faced their demons, confronted their pasts, and found love in the midst of adversity. And now, they were ready to face whatever lay ahead, together, united by their love, their courage, and their shared dream of a hidden valley, a place of peace, a place of refuge, a place where they could finally build a new life, a new home, a new beginning. The heart's reckoning had led them to this point, and they were ready to embrace their destiny, whatever it may be. Chapter 16. Fire and Ice. The entrance to the valley was narrow and treacherous, a winding passage through the heart of the mountain. Martha led the way, her knowledge of the hidden trails guiding them through the darkness, the air growing cooler and damper with each step. As they emerged from the passage, they gasped in awe. Before them lay a hidden valley, a breathtaking oasis of lush greenery, sparkling streams, and towering trees. It was a paradise, a sanctuary, a place that seemed untouched by the harsh realities of the outside world. Waterfalls cascaded down the cliffs, feeding into a crystal-clear river that meandered through the valley floor. Wildflowers bloomed in abundance, their vibrant colors painting the landscape in a tapestry of beauty. Wildlife roamed freely, deer grazing peacefully in the meadows, birds singing in the trees, a testament to the valley's unspoiled nature. Rosie and Garrett were speechless, their hearts overflowing with joy and gratitude. They had found it, their hidden valley, their refuge, their new home. Martha smiled, her blue eyes twinkling with satisfaction. "Welcome home," she said, her voice filled with warmth. They spent the following days exploring the valley, discovering its hidden treasures, its secret places, its abundance of resources. They found a perfect spot to build their new home, a clearing near the river, sheltered by towering trees, with a breathtaking view of the surrounding mountains. They began to build, working tirelessly, their efforts fueled by their shared dream, their love for each other, their determination to create a new life. They felled trees, shaped logs, and raised the walls of their cabin, their hands working in harmony, their hearts beating as one. But their newfound peace was shattered by an unexpected arrival. A lone rider appeared at the entrance to the valley, a figure silhouetted against the setting sun. Rosie and Garrett, alerted by the sound of hooves, grabbed their rifles and took up positions near the entrance, their bodies tense, their eyes narrowed in suspicion. As the rider drew closer, they recognized him. It was Cyrus Thornton, the man who had destroyed Garrett's life, the man who had been pursuing them relentlessly. He reined in his horse, his face a mask of cold fury, his eyes burning with hatred. He was alone, but he radiated an aura of menace, of power, of ruthless determination. "Landry," he said, his voice a venomous snarl. "I've found you." Garrett stepped forward, his rifle raised, his body poised for action. "Thornton," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You're not welcome here." "This is my land now," Thornton said, his gaze sweeping across the valley. "I bought it from the bank, and I'm here to take what's mine." Rosie stepped forward, her rifle aimed at Thornton. "This valley belongs to no one," she said, her voice ringing with defiance. "It's a sanctuary, a place of peace, and we won't let you defile it." Thornton laughed, a cold, cruel sound that echoed through the valley. "You think you can stop me, old woman?" he asked. "I have men coming. They'll be here soon, and they'll kill anyone who stands in their way." "They'll have to kill us first," Garrett said, his voice unwavering. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the threat of violence. Thornton's eyes flickered between Rosie and Garrett, a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. He'd expected to find them broken, defeated, easy prey. But they stood before him, strong and defiant, their love a shield, their determination a weapon. "This doesn't have to end in bloodshed, Thornton," Garrett said. "Leave now, and we'll let you go. Stay, and you'll die." Thornton hesitated. He was a bully, a coward at heart, used to getting his way through intimidation and violence. But he sensed something different in Garrett, in Rosie, a strength of will, a depth of resolve that he hadn't encountered before. "I'll be back," he said, finally, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and frustration. "With more men. And I'll take this valley, and I'll kill you both." He turned his horse and galloped away, disappearing into the darkness. Rosie and Garrett lowered their rifles, their bodies trembling with adrenaline. They had won a temporary reprieve, but they knew this was just the beginning. Thornton would return, and he would bring an army with him. They looked at each other, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. They had found their paradise, but they would have to fight to keep it. Their love, their courage, their resilience would be tested once again, in a final confrontation that would determine their fate, their future, their very survival. The battle between fire and ice, between hatred and love, between greed and compassion, was about to begin, and the hidden valley would be the battleground. Chapter 17. Trials by Fire. The threat of Thornton's return loomed over the valley, casting a shadow over their newfound paradise. Rosie, Garrett, and Martha prepared for the inevitable confrontation, fortifying their defenses, gathering supplies, and making plans. They knew they were outnumbered, outgunned, but they were determined to fight for their home, for their love, for their future. Martha, with her knowledge of the valley and its hidden passages, proved to be an invaluable ally. She showed them secret trails, hidden caves, and strategic vantage points that would give them an advantage in the coming battle. Rosie, with her sharpshooting skills and her unwavering determination, was a force to be reckoned with. She practiced her aim, honing her skills, preparing to defend her home and the man she loved. Garrett, with his experience as a fighter, his calm demeanor, and his strategic mind, was their leader, their protector, their rock. He devised a plan, utilizing the terrain to their advantage, setting traps, and preparing for a siege. They worked together seamlessly, their individual strengths complementing each other, their shared purpose uniting them. They were a family, bound together by love, loyalty, and a fierce determination to survive. As they waited for Thornton's arrival, they also took time to celebrate their love. They exchanged vows in a simple ceremony by the river, Martha officiating, the birds singing their wedding song, the mountains standing as silent witnesses. It was a moment of pure joy, a brief respite from the looming threat, a reaffirmation of their commitment to each other. But the peace was short-lived. Scouts, posted at the entrance to the valley, reported the approach of Thornton's men. A large force, heavily armed, was making its way towards them. The battle was about to begin. Rosie, Garrett, and Martha took up their positions, their hearts pounding, their senses alert. They waited, hidden among the rocks and trees, their rifles ready, their bodies tense with anticipation. Thornton's men entered the valley, their arrogance evident in their swaggering postures, their loud voices, their careless disregard for the beauty and tranquility of the place. They were expecting an easy victory, a quick rout of a few isolated settlers. They were wrong. Garrett's plan unfolded with deadly precision. Traps were sprung, rocks were dislodged, causing confusion and casualties among Thornton's men. Rosie and Garrett, firing from concealed positions, picked off the attackers with deadly accuracy. Martha, with her knowledge of the terrain, guided them through the hidden trails, allowing them to outmaneuver their enemies. The battle raged, the valley echoing with the sounds of gunfire, shouts, and the screams of wounded men. Thornton's men, initially confident, were thrown into disarray, their advance stalled, their numbers dwindling. Thornton, enraged by their resistance, urged his men forward, his voice a furious roar. He was determined to crush them, to take the valley, to claim his revenge. But Rosie, Garrett, and Martha fought with the courage of desperation, their love for each other, their determination to protect their home, fueling their resistance. They were a force to be reckoned with, a small band of defenders against a much larger enemy. As the battle reached its climax, Garrett found himself face to face with Thornton. The two men, their hatred for each other palpable, engaged in a brutal hand-to-hand fight. They wrestled, punched, and kicked, their bodies locked in a deadly embrace. Garrett, despite his years of hardship, was still a formidable fighter. He used his strength, his skill, and his rage to gain the upper hand. He disarmed Thornton, knocking him to the ground, his fist raised, ready to deliver the final blow. But he hesitated. He looked into Thornton's eyes, saw the fear, the desperation, the emptiness. He saw a broken man, a man consumed by hatred and greed, a man who had lost everything, including his soul. He lowered his fist. He couldn't do it. He couldn't kill him in cold blood. It wasn't in him. "It's over, Thornton," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Leave this valley, and never come back." Thornton, stunned by Garrett's mercy, scrambled to his feet. He looked around, saw his men scattered and defeated, his dreams of conquest shattered. He turned and fled, disappearing into the wilderness, a broken and defeated man. The remaining members of Thornton's gang, seeing their leader flee, surrendered. They were disarmed and sent away, their threats extinguished, their arrogance humbled. The battle was over. Rosie, Garrett, and Martha had won. They had defended their home, protected their love, and secured their future. The trials by fire had tested them, but they had emerged victorious, their bond stronger, their love deeper, their spirits unbroken. The valley was safe, their sanctuary secured, their dream realized. Chapter 18. The Truth Unveiled. With Thornton gone and the valley secured, Rosie, Garrett, and Martha began to rebuild, to heal, and to create a new life for themselves. The scars of the battle remained, both physical and emotional, but they were slowly fading, replaced by a growing sense of peace, of belonging, of hope. They repaired the damage to their cabin, they tended to the wounded, and they buried the dead, honoring their fallen enemies with a simple ceremony. They worked together, their hands and hearts united, their spirits lifted by their victory and their shared dream. But there was one loose end, one unresolved issue that still lingered in Garrett's mind. The charges against him in Texas, the false accusations of murder and rustling, still hung over him, preventing him from truly being free. He knew he could never return to Texas, never clear his name, without risking capture and imprisonment. But he also couldn't live with the lie, with the knowledge that he was considered a criminal, a fugitive from justice. One evening, as they were sitting by the fire, sharing stories and dreams, Garrett spoke his mind. "I need to clear my name, Rosalie," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of determination and resignation. "I can't live like this forever, always looking over my shoulder, always afraid of being caught." Rosie looked at him, her heart filled with love and concern. "But how, Garrett?" she asked. "You can't go back to Texas. It's too dangerous." "I know," he said, "but maybe there's another way. Maybe someone can help us, someone who knows the truth, someone who can expose Thornton's lies." Martha, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. "There's an old friend of my husband's," she said. "A lawyer in Santa Fe. He's an honest man, a man of integrity. He might be able to help." Garrett's eyes lit up with a flicker of hope. "Do you think he would?" he asked. "I don't know," Martha said, "but it's worth a try. I can write to him, tell him your story, ask him to come here." And so, Martha wrote a letter to her husband's friend, a lawyer named Samuel Walker, explaining Garrett's situation, detailing Thornton's crimes, and pleading for his help. They sent the letter with a passing traveler, hoping it would reach its destination, hoping that Samuel Walker would be willing to take on their case. Weeks turned into months, and they waited, their hopes dwindling with each passing day. They continued to work on the ranch, building their new life, but the uncertainty of Garrett's situation cast a shadow over their happiness. Then, one morning, a rider appeared at the entrance to the valley. It was a stranger, a well-dressed man with a kind face and intelligent eyes. He introduced himself as Samuel Walker. Garrett and Rosie welcomed him into their cabin, their hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation. Samuel Walker listened intently to their story, his eyes filled with compassion and understanding. "I believe you, Mr. Landry," he said, finally, "and I'm willing to help you. But it won't be easy. Thornton is a powerful man with many connections, and the evidence against you is strong." "But it's all lies," Garrett said, his voice filled with frustration. "I was framed." "I know," Samuel Walker said, "but we need proof. We need witnesses, evidence, something to convince a judge that you're innocent." He paused, then continued. "I've done some research, and I've discovered something that might help. There was a witness to the murder of your wife and son, a young woman who worked for Thornton. She disappeared shortly after the trial, and everyone assumed she was dead." "But you think she's alive?" Rosie asked, her voice filled with hope. "I do," Samuel Walker said. "I have reason to believe she's hiding somewhere in New Mexico. If we can find her, and if she's willing to testify, we might be able to clear your name." It was a long shot, a risky undertaking, but it was their only hope. Garrett, Rosie, and Samuel Walker decided to travel to New Mexico to search for the missing witness, to uncover the truth, to finally clear Garrett's name. Their journey was fraught with danger, with the constant threat of Thornton's men discovering them, with the challenges of navigating unfamiliar territory. But they were driven by their determination, by their hope, by their belief in justice. After weeks of searching, they finally found her. The missing witness, a young woman named Sarah Jane, was living in a small, remote village, hiding under an assumed name, her life filled with fear and regret. She was initially reluctant to talk, afraid of Thornton's retribution. But Rosie, with her gentle compassion and her unwavering belief in Garrett's innocence, managed to convince her to tell her story. Sarah Jane revealed the truth, the horrifying truth of Thornton's crimes. She testified that she had witnessed Thornton's men kill Garrett's wife and son, that she had seen Thornton frame Garrett for the murders, that she had been forced to lie under oath, threatened with her life if she refused. Her testimony was the missing piece of the puzzle, the evidence they needed to clear Garrett's name. Samuel Walker, with his legal expertise and his unwavering commitment to justice, presented the evidence to a judge in Santa Fe. The judge, after reviewing the evidence and hearing Sarah Jane's testimony, overturned Garrett's conviction, declaring him a free man. The truth had been unveiled, justice had been served, and Garrett's name had finally been cleared. The echoes of betrayal, the shadows of the past, were finally dispelled, replaced by the bright light of truth and the promise of a new beginning. Chapter 19. Redemption Song. With Garrett's name cleared and the threat of Thornton removed, Rosie and Garrett returned to the Hidden Valley, their hearts filled with joy, relief, and a profound sense of gratitude. They had faced their demons, overcome their challenges, and emerged victorious, their love stronger, their bond deeper, their spirits renewed. They were welcomed back by Martha, who had kept the valley safe during their absence, her unwavering loyalty and her quiet strength a testament to the power of friendship and the resilience of the human spirit. They resumed their life in the valley, building their home, tending to their land, and creating a community with a few other settlers who had found their way to the sanctuary. They shared their knowledge, their skills, and their resources, creating a haven of peace, cooperation, and mutual respect. Garrett, freed from the burden of his past, embraced his new life with a passion and a purpose he hadn't felt in years. He used his skills as a rancher, a fighter, and a leader to help build the community, to protect it from outside threats, and to ensure its prosperity. Rosie, too, found a renewed sense of purpose, a joy in her life that she hadn't experienced since before Thomas's death. She tended to her garden, she cared for the animals, and she shared her wisdom and her compassion with the other members of the community. She was a mother figure, a mentor, a friend to all. They lived a simple life, a life close to nature, a life filled with hard work, quiet companionship, and the deep satisfaction of building something meaningful, something lasting, something beautiful. One evening, as they were sitting on the porch of their cabin, watching the sun set over the mountains, their hands clasped together, their hearts filled with contentment, Garrett spoke. "I never thought I'd find happiness again, Rosalie," he said, his voice soft. "After losing everything, I thought my life was over. But you gave me a second chance. You showed me that there was still hope, still love, still beauty in the world." Rosie smiled, her eyes filled with tears of joy. "And you, Garrett," she said, "you gave me a reason to live again. You showed me that I wasn't alone, that I could still love, that I could still be happy." They kissed a long, tender kiss that spoke of their deep love, their unwavering commitment, their shared gratitude for the life they had built together. As the years passed, the valley flourished. More settlers arrived, drawn by the stories of peace, prosperity, and the legendary couple who had defended it against all odds. The community grew, their bonds strengthening, their shared values creating a unique and vibrant society. Rosie and Garrett, revered as the founders of the valley, became symbols of hope, resilience, and the power of love. They were living proof that even in the harshest of environments, even in the face of the greatest adversity, it was possible to build a better world, a world based on compassion, cooperation, and respect. They had children and grandchildren who grew up in the valley, learning the values of their parents and grandparents, carrying on their legacy, ensuring that the sanctuary would endure for generations to come. One day, as Rosie and Garrett, now old and gray, were sitting on the porch of their cabin, watching their grandchildren play in the meadow, they heard a familiar sound. The sound of a harmonica, playing a mournful tune, a melody that Garrett had often hummed in his darker days. They looked up and saw a figure approaching, an old man with a weathered face and kind eyes. It was Billy, the young bounty hunter they had spared years ago. He had returned, not as an enemy, but as a friend. He had kept his promise. He had left Arizona and never returned, until now. He had built a new life for himself, a life of honesty and hard work, a life inspired by the mercy and the compassion that Rosie and Garrett had shown him. He had come to thank them, to tell them that they had changed his life, that they had shown him a better way, that they had given him a second chance. He played his harmonica for them, a song of redemption, a song of gratitude, a song of hope. And as the music filled the valley, Rosie and Garrett knew that their lives had been well lived, that their struggles had been worthwhile, that their love had created something truly special, something that would endure long after they were gone. Redemption's song echoed through the valley, a testament to their courage, their resilience, and the transformative power of love, forgiveness, and second chances. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. Years melted into decades, and the hidden valley thrived under the watchful eyes of Rosie and Garrett. Their love story became a legend, whispered around campfires and shared among the growing community. They were the heart of the valley, their wisdom and strength a guiding light for all who lived there. But even in paradise, the echoes of the past could still find their way in. A new generation had risen, children and grandchildren who knew only the peace and prosperity of the valley. They had heard the stories of Thornton, of the bounty hunters, of the struggles Rosie and Garrett had endured, but those tales seemed distant, like legends from a bygone era. One day, a stranger arrived in the valley, a young man with a familiar face, a face that stirred old memories and awakened long-dormant fears. He introduced himself as Caleb Thornton, the grandson of Cyrus Thornton. Rosie and Garrett, now in their twilight years, their bodies frail but their spirits still strong, greeted him with caution. They saw the resemblance to his grandfather, the same cold eyes, the same arrogant posture. But they also saw something else, a hint of uncertainty, a flicker of vulnerability, that suggested he might not be the same man as his grandfather. Caleb Thornton had come seeking answers, not revenge. He had grown up hearing stories of his grandfather's defeat, of the legendary couple who had defended the hidden valley. He had also discovered documents, hidden away in his grandfather's belongings, that revealed the truth about Cyrus Thornton's crimes, about Garrett's innocence. He had come to the valley not to reclaim it, but to understand it, to learn from the people who had defeated his grandfather, to find out what made this place so special, so resilient, so worthy of defending. Rosie and Garrett, after much deliberation, decided to trust him. They shared their stories, their struggles, their triumphs. They showed him the valley, the community they had built, the life they had created. Caleb was moved by their story, by their courage, by their unwavering commitment to justice and compassion. He saw the stark contrast between his grandfather's greed and ruthlessness and the values that governed the valley. He realized that his grandfather had been wrong, that Garrett and Rosie had been right. He spent weeks in the valley, learning from Rosie and Garrett, absorbing their wisdom, understanding their way of life. He saw the love that bound them together, the respect they had for each other and for the land, the sense of community that permeated every aspect of their lives. He also saw the challenges they faced. The valley, while prosperous, was still isolated, vulnerable to outside threats. The younger generation, while strong and capable, lacked the experience and the wisdom of their elders. Caleb, realizing the value of what Rosie and Garrett had created, decided to help them. He used his knowledge, his resources, and his connections to the outside world to strengthen the valley's defenses, to improve its infrastructure, and to establish trade routes that would ensure its continued prosperity. He also worked to bridge the gap between the valley and the outside world, to educate people about the community's values, to promote understanding and cooperation. He became an ambassador for the valley, a champion of its cause, a defender of its legacy. One evening, as Caleb was preparing to leave the valley, he spoke to Rosie and Garrett. "I came here seeking revenge," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "But I found something much more valuable. I found truth. I found justice. I found love. You have shown me a better way, a better life. And I will spend the rest of my days honoring your legacy, protecting this valley, and carrying on your work." Rosie and Garrett, their hearts filled with pride and gratitude, embraced him. They had found an unexpected ally, a descendant of their enemy who had become their friend, their protector, their heir. As Caleb rode away, Rosie and Garrett knew that the valley was safe, that their legacy would endure, that their love story would continue to inspire generations to come. They had faced their final confrontation, not with violence, but with compassion, not with hatred, but with love. And they had won, not just a battle, but a victory for the human spirit, a testament to the power of forgiveness, redemption, and the enduring strength of love. The horizons of their hearts, once filled with fear and uncertainty, were now clear, bright, and filled with the promise of a peaceful and prosperous future, a future secured not by force, but by the enduring power of love and understanding. Epilogue. The years continued their relentless march, and the time came when Rosie and Garrett, their bodies weary but their spirits undimmed, finally succumbed to the embrace of eternity. They passed away peacefully, in their sleep, their hands clasped together, their love a beacon that had guided them through a lifetime of challenges and triumphs. The entire valley mourned their passing, their grief a testament to the profound impact Rosie and Garrett had had on their lives. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the valley, their graves marked by simple stones, engraved with their names and a single word: love. But their legacy lived on, not just in the memories of those who had known them, but in the thriving community they had built, in the values they had instilled, in the love that continued to bind the valley together. Caleb Thornton, true to his word, became the protector of the valley, guiding it through the changing times, ensuring its continued prosperity and its unwavering commitment to peace, justice, and compassion. He married a woman from the valley, raised a family, and became a wise and respected leader, carrying on the traditions of Rosie and Garrett. The Hidden Valley became a legend, a symbol of hope, resilience, and the power of love to overcome adversity. Stories of Rosie and Garrett, of their courage, their compassion, their unwavering commitment to each other and to their community, were passed down through generations, inspiring countless others to seek a better life, to build a better world. The valley remained a sanctuary, a place where people could find refuge from the harsh realities of the outside world, a place where they could live in harmony with nature, with each other, and with themselves. It was a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, to the transformative power of love, and to the enduring legacy of two remarkable individuals who had dared to dream of a better future and had fought to make that dream a reality. And as the sun set over the mountains, casting its golden rays upon the peaceful valley, the whispers of the wind carried the echoes of their love story, a timeless tale of courage, resilience, and the enduring power of the human heart to find its way home, to build a paradise, to create a legacy that would last forever. The dust had settled, the battles were won, and the love of Rosie and Garrett remained, a beacon of hope shining brightly in the heart of the Hidden Valley, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit and the transformative magic of a love that conquered all.